You've actually brought some props with you to the studio today. We don't usually have visual aids, so I'm really excited about this. Why don't you explain what you've brought with you, bearing in mind that some of our listeners won't be watching this on YouTube, so they can't see what you've got.
Right, so these are just some examples that off my slightly abstruse bookshelves are from the 1970s, which just popped into my head when I was thinking about coming in. So the first is partly because this is by a former military officer called Richard Clutterbuck. This is a book called Britain in Agony, The Growth of Political Violence, with a photograph of the police looking put upon, which is posterised to make it extra dramatic. During the 6 years from 1971 to 1977, violent picketing, demonstrations and terrorism reached their highest peak in Britain since 1911. Well, fair point, but, Britain eventually left agony. But on the way, there was this book, which is so dramatic a title that it has to have the back and the front.
Wow.
The Coming Confrontation, Will the Open Society Survive to 1989, the product of the Institute of Economic Affairs, featuring rather bracingly an essay based on a radio broadcast by the Duke of Edinburgh, amongst others, as well as pieces by F.A. Hayek and Nigel Lawson, who I asked about that. And that's basically, if we don't face down the unions and get to Thatcherism, then, we will end up in totalitarian hell.
Yeah.
But, suggesting...
I'm getting ideas for New Statesman covers from
these.
This is helpful.
Yeah, the Coming Confrontation. Well, there are covers in the past that have echoes of this. And then this is actually a novel, but it's just so... I got this found this mentioned in Tony Benn's diaries, I think. This is Apocalypse 2000.
Oh, wow.
By Peter Jay and Michael Stewart. So Peter Jay, not a man known for writing books that are a devastating vision of social collapse, found to be exceptionally good by the Sunday Times. But this is about, basically the entire world collapsing on fire, which has an American fascist leader and Europe collapsing into... Europe has a fascist leader as well. And, everything goes very, very bad. Now, that, to be fair, is a novel, but it's obviously from political kind of realism, political analysis starting point. The reason for doing that is just that we do this quite a lot when we're stuck. When democracy gets stuck and can't find a solution, basically because there are two clashing unthinkables that we can't, decide between. We can't decide which one to prioritise.
Yeah.
In the 30s, in the 70s, we get stuck, and that means that democracy looks like it can't function. Politicians look useless, and so the extremes start to, thrive, and people start to contemplate terrible scenarios. My argument, as I make in the piece and in one of my books, is basically that this is usually, so far anyway, I may be wrong this time, but so far this has been part of a process of deciding what new unthinkable we're going to allow to be the thing that we say must never happen again, and we must base our new consensus around it. It's striking to me that about 3 or 4 years after The Coming Confrontation was published, the IA also published a book, which sadly enough I have at home as well, called The Emerging Consensus. So we do get from The Coming Confrontation to The Emerging Consensus quite quick, provided that politics responds to, the sense of that things have got intolerable and starts to persuade itself to do things it thought it couldn't because the alternative looks so bad. Yes,
and let's go through some of those historical examples that you lay out in your piece where people were making predictions of civil war. So, there's all sorts here, aren't there? Political tensions over Home Rule in 1914, Lloyd George setting up a civil defence force in the face of joint strikes by miners and rail workers after the First World War, during the 1930s Depression, the Conservatives trying to invoke those fears ahead of the 1945 election. Around the time of Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech, and even the miners' strikes and the fox hunting ban as well. It's just, it crops up all the time in different guises. What's the sort of common thread, do you think, in these examples that you picked out?
Well, at least in most of them, as I say, it's that things have got to a point where we can no longer tolerate them, but we can't agree on the change we're going to make. Some of the early ones come out of almost more straightforward, conflicts, and if you're in, a political conflict is getting more and more aggressive and tense, then, if you extrapolate out, you end up with civil war. So, what's happening before the First World War, we forget that, for a fairly obvious reason, that the summer of 1914 is a very, very tense time in British politics. There's industrial unrest. I think there's the suffragette movement is becoming more and more radical and in some cases violent. But most of all, you have this extraordinary kind of confrontation over Home Rule in, what we would now think, in Ireland as a whole. But obviously in what we would now refer to as Northern Ireland, that is particularly tense because you have, a large Protestant population.
Yeah.
So you have this thing called the Ulster Covenant that a barrister called Sir Edward Carson encourages people to sign, which is basically committing to do what it takes to stop Home Rule in Northern Ireland. That is not unconnected with the beginnings of the Ulster Volunteers, which becomes the Ulster Volunteer Force. You have guns being run into Northern Ireland. You have the Conservative Party leaders saying there are things stronger than parliamentary majorities. There's a mutiny sort of at the Curragh base and so on. So, and that's obviously is heading in the direction that we know towards actual real, a conflict which is too complicated to go into here, but in the decade that follows. But we also have, which we completely forget, I think, is the British Covenant, which is sort of a movement led by Lord Alfred Milner, who had been, the Lord of South Africa, and who is not a man, therefore, given necessarily to thinking in a modern democratic fashion. But there is wide support for the idea that something must be done to stop Home Rule. Edward Elgar, Rudyard Kipling signed this thing, and there are. It's projecting forwards, but you can see people arming and drilling in British cities at that point. So that's one. That's relatively straightforward and slightly different because mass democracy doesn't really begin till after the First World War. But then you start seeing in the 20s and 30s, the trade unions are becoming more and more powerful. They've got more and more members. Britain is economically struggling in a way that it hadn't been decades before, and you have mass democracy. And you have the Labour Party. So you have, great pressure for, working people not to be pushed backwards as they were after the First World War in terms of their pay. And you have syndicalism, the idea that, the trade unions themselves could effectively kind of take over the country. So, this is a whole, this is like decades of history, right? But so I'm going to go into all of it. But you have periodically a sense that, things have got so tense that if you extrapolate forwards, this is going to break out into conflict. And it doesn't. And I would argue it's not that it doesn't because the English are better than other countries. It's because there are sufficient countervailing forces in each of these specific situations to find a solution to calm things down. Usually, as I say, by people doing something that previously they thought they couldn't, which is 1945 is the great big example of that, right? 1945 is much of what the left had wanted in the 30s, which had been, they could only see a way of getting to via civil conflict, and therefore it was impossible. After the Second World War, the boundaries of the politically possible have completely changed, and it just happens by democracy.
Right. Okay. And to some of our listeners and viewers, it might come as a surprise that there is now talk of an oncoming civil war. So
it's always a bracing conversation.
So if they haven't been paying attention, let's go through, some of the comments that have been made by high-profile figures recently. I mean, Lisa Nandy. She's in the cabinet. She warned that Labour's northern heartlands could go up in flames. Dominic Cummings has been talking about it, former advisor to Boris Johnson, the mastermind of the Brexit campaign. He's said that such conversations are no longer abnormal about civil war. And the radical right academic Matthew Goodwin has asked if Britain is about to blow. So there's a bit of talk of this around. Can you give us an idea of when this started and why, and who the main figures are who are actually discussing this?
Sure. So this really starts to sort of snap into people's attention, I think, in February when Louise Perry, the podcaster, interviews an academic at King's College London called Professor David Betts, who, working on, based on scholarship, which is his territory, and to do with strategy, and people who have studied or studies of previous civil wars and the factors that tend to set the ground for them, arguing that in that interview, but also in a paper that he'd written before that, which is what prompted the interview, two-part strategy paper, effectively, that there are a series of conditions that you haven't seen in the West, but across the West you can now begin to see, particularly to do with, there's various different ideas there, but one of them is a sense of status loss, status sort of downgrading, that the kind of, to be very blunt, basically that, white British people feel like they are being downgraded. And he refers to the Great Replacement theory, which is a kind of, fairly pernicious conspiracy theory. I don't think he's necessarily endorsing it, but flagging it as a sign of people's, angst.
Right.
And then there's economic factors, which are brought in as well. So he talks in those terms, and he extrapolates forwards and says that the chances of civil war are roughly 4% a year. But if you add that up over 5 years, you get to 18% or 18.5%. I've got the figures slightly rough there, but that it's basically just under 1 in 5 chance in the next 5 years.
Okay.
Right.
So he's put a number to it.
But that's one way of calculating it, probability. I'm not sure I would necessarily do it that way. But yeah, so I think that's one big voice. But then you've also had obviously people picking up on it who are, who are more in the thick of the kind of political sort of fray or the kind of online sort of fray. People like, as you say, Matthew Goodwin and so on. But then you have Dominic Cummings, who sort of sits between those two in a rather interesting way, because he's clearly drawing on conversations he's having with people that he can speak to because he knows them from having been at the core of power. But he's also going on YouTube and doing long, fairly kind of, eye-watering interviews. But again, what's striking about that is that if you watch his Sky interview, which is the thing that brought most attention to this, he in his Substack, he talked about this in sort of ethnic terms. Again, not saying that he wants it to happen or anything, just as Betts isn't saying wants it to happen. But in the Substack, he's talking about it in sort of terms of a fear in Whitehall of ethnic conflict in Britain, which is a very, very startling prospect, and one we could all think of reasons why that might not happen, like, how we all live all day.
Yes.
But there's also, and I think this has been underplayed in the way we've talked about this, there's also an economic element to it. Betts refers to this, talks about financialisation reaching the end of the road. Cummings also says, like, what he hears in focus groups, and this accords with the stuff that More in Common have been reporting, that people feel like, I can't get a GP appointment, local services don't work. I mean, you've reported on this, the systems just are not working anymore, and I've had no pay rise for 15 years.
Yeah.
So the question then comes how you connect those two. I wouldn't connect them in the way that the predictions that reach civil war would, but that's clearly the core of it.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And I wonder, what it, even if the prospect of civil war doesn't necessarily seem likely, I wonder what it tells us about the national psyche, that there is talk of this, but also the underlying conditions that might lead to this talk or fears within the political establishment. Yeah,
I mean, I think the way that I tend to read this sort of talk is less that it's a prediction for most people.
Yeah.
It's more a projection forwards. This is a distinction the OBR make, curiously. Right. They don't predict, they project. Yeah. But it's a kind of, if things continue like this and no countervailing forces intervene, we would eventually end up here. And that's, for some people, is grift. For some people, it's kind of political rhetoric. For some people, it's meant more sort of seriously and sincerely. But either which way, it's effectively saying where we are now is taking us to a bad place. It's intolerable. The stakes involved in the status quo are so high, we need to think about changes we wouldn't otherwise previously have considered. The process I was talking about before. So I think that's basically the sort of the mechanics of it. But I think as I say, the sense of a very long time of stagnant pay, services not working, but still paying high taxes, still working really hard, running to standstill for year after year after year. Add into that small boats and hotels, and you can see why, as you've written, people get angry. The question then is how you respond to it.
Yes, and what do you think the government's response should be to this? Because we've seen, a fair bit of tension and turmoil this summer, not on the same level as the riots last year, but this is going to be a running sore for the government unless it can put a lid on it. And there's no sign really, particularly on the hotels issue, that they can prove that the government actually has control over these issues. From the sewage in the rivers to the small boats crossing the channel, there's this feeling, I think, that I pick up from people who I interview, that the government just can't control things, and people don't understand why, because they elected them, they're supposed to be in charge, but they're always saying, well, we can only end this hotel policy by 2029. Well, why?
Right, and they literally lost a court case the other day. Where they were trying to kind of. Ironically, what's ironic about the court case in Epping is that the basis on which the council has managed to kind of get an injunction to stop that hotel being accommodation for asylum seekers is actually on the same sort of way of doing things as is usually coming the other direction. Yeah. It's kind of a technicality in a town planning law. Well, that's the sort of thing that lawyers have done to stop people being deported who, common sense would suggest should be deported. So it's kind of interesting to see the world of rules clashing against the world of rules, which I think actually is a big part of what needs to be rethought. So, okay, what can they do? Clearly and obviously, and they are trying, you try and deal with the problem, at its head. They have managed to reduce, or the numbers have been coming down of asylum hotels. Yeah. The boat numbers are going up, but clearly they're trying to do that. There's various, the one in, one out. There's talk of setting up asylum, processing centres in the north of France. There's a think tank I work with called Future Governance Forum, who've done some very interesting work on that. There's that. But there's also, as I say, I think the fact that it seems pretty clear that this stuff is only ever symbolic. It's never just real, right? It's also about, with hotels, what does a hotel represent? It represents, this town used to be really pretty. It represents, that's where my mum got married and we used to go for dinner. It represents, we were never asked about this. Yeah. Now, all of those factors are absolutely relevant in making people angry and unhappy with nothing to do with immigrants. Yeah. Similarly, small boats, the government doesn't have control, as you were saying, they say they want to, but they can't do anything. So this weird sense that the government simultaneously has too much power, too little power. And this is where the rules thing, I think, is crucial. There's a fantastic book by a guy called Dan Davis called The Unaccountability Machine, where he talks about the idea of the accountability sink. This is his sort of concept of how you devise a system that's so rules-based, no one is actually to blame for anything, right? I mean, we've all had this talking to, the poor receptionist who just has to kind of power out the company policy. But that extrapolated out to how we govern the country has, I think, now reached an absolute crisis point, right? And I think until and unless we address that way of doing things, which is quite basic to how we govern, but it hasn't been the case forever, we are going to keep going around in this sort of doom loop.
I just wanted to go back and ask, what is the closest Britain has come to facing civil war in the past century when you've been looking over, the historical examples?
Well, obviously this is, elevated guesswork, maybe just guesswork, but I think in the last century, so from 1925 onwards, that actually is just before that, I think, a couple of the most dangerous moments. I think if the First World War hadn't broken out, there was risk of serious conflict of some kind, not full civil war, but, violence in 1914 over Home Rule in some of our cities, I think. I think in 1919, you had some pretty serious stuff going on, particularly in Glasgow, Red Clydeside and all of that. There is a point in, I think it's in 1919, when the government in cabinet sort of talks about using biplanes for basically sort of, affect a form of public order. I mean, they don't, but the sense that things are reaching an absolute breaking point in the years after the First World War is much stronger than I think we tend to remember. The 30s tends to pull focus. So I think those points, which are, as I say, just before a century back, are two. I think also there's a point in, I don't think it would reach civil war at all. But I do think in February 1974, I think, Labour scraped back in. I think the Conservatives actually got more votes. If you'd had a returned Conservative government then, and that had carried through into the winter of 1974, and there had been what Hugh Scanlon was talking about, which was something approaching a general strike, I think that the attitude on the right, this is when you have talk of private armies and military coups and all that stuff. The attitude on the right had become sufficiently sort of desperate and antagonized that we might have seen something pretty serious around picket lines. But that's multiple contingencies.
Yes,
and even then, I don't think it would have reached civil war.
Oh, well, thank you for going down that path with me. And of course, the dismissal from many that this would ever happen in Britain is because the Brits are too complacent or they're too passive. I mean, I remember when I was going to cover the protests in Epping, a police officer turned to me and said, rain can do what 100 police forces can do. Right. Is there any truth in that? I
mean, I'm very, very wary of this. Where our character is just so kind of like, mild, much milder than others. I think it's much more to do with specifics, right? As I say, just because it hasn't happened doesn't mean it could never happen. I think that's to go, the job in politics is to steer a path between panic and complacency, right? So you don't go so far from panic, you end up in complacency. If you look at the specifics of why America, which is what Enoch Powell was drawing on, for example, in 1968, became so violent in the late 1960s and early 1970s, there are certain particular things about America which I think did militate towards that, its particular history. In terms of race and slavery and civil rights, its sheer size, its militarized nature. What you now have in America, of course, is vastly more guns. It'd be much easier to organize a civil war in America than it would here. What would we fight with? Hockey sticks? I mean, but that's not because we're better. It's because we have a particular history on gun laws. So, I think there's lots of countries in the world where it's relatively unlikely. I don't think there's anything particularly special about us. I do think, though, that we should be kind of situationally specific in how we read where we are not. And this is where I think the political science side of it can be a bit sort of dicey, is if you sort of take civil wars in 30 countries and sort of, extrapolate out the common causes, fair enough. But what you're missing from that is all the different specificities which come back the other way, which for probably different reasons mean it doesn't happen. Yeah. So I just think being situationally specific is the only way.
So we've talked about some of the conditions on the ground that might be causing some of the talk of civil war, or at least violence and riots. How much, I mean, you mentioned the word grift in the first section. How much of this is this, certain actors, particularly on the political right or the radical right, wanting this to happen or wanting to sort of stir things up to get attention, but also perhaps to get the political ends that they wish?
Well, I think the nature of political extremism is that the situation you're working in is, hard for you to make headway in because you're at the edge of it. What you want to do in terms of support, in terms of ideas, in terms of where the bounds of the possible sit, is to pull things towards where you sit, right? And this is why contingencies which say, or projections which say, if the status quo continues, it will lead to something disastrous. Worse perhaps than you, dear YouTube watcher, fear from me, then you can start to tip things. So you can see a perfectly rational strategic reason, and the left does this as well as the right, with different content, with different material, to make those arguments. But we also obviously live in an online, attention economy where if you say something, well, I think possibly caveat, we might possibly have this slightly bad thing happen, you're going to get fewer clicks than if you say, I predict civil war.
Yes.
Right? I mean, that's obvious. And so, it's unsurprising that people, find themselves possibly without necessarily making that decision one at a time, in the aggregate, saying this stuff more than perhaps they would if they were just talking, around a seminar table.
Yeah,
so
and
I think
an insight into that is that your piece did extremely well, I'm sure, because it's a great piece, but also civil war, just the words in the headline tend to attract attention. So
right,
yeah, not
exactly.
That you were calling for it. You're not one of those YouTubers yet.
I am not one of those YouTubers. Perhaps I would be richer if I was. But.
And you've joined us on the podcast before to discuss conspiracy theories. And I wonder if there's a crossover between the sort of milieu around conspiracy theories, particularly online, and those who evoke the prospect of civil war online now that you were just discussing.
I mean, I haven't looked into the sort of specific sort of network, so I don't know the answer to that in terms of kind of individual links. But I certainly think that there is a kind of a similar pattern of argument where you start with something, that is true, and then you extrapolate out. And you extrapolate out in particular ways. You're always looking for something which is sort of total and extreme and intolerable. That's what a conspiracy theory is sort of always heading towards. And in particular, as I say, it's about ignoring all the countervailing possibilities. So, I'm not suggesting that he's a conspiracy theorist, but for example, I was watching, I think it's Colonel Richard Kemp on Connor Tomlinson's podcast from a few days ago, where he said, I predict not just civil unrest, but civil war. And I was listening to the argument, and this is not, he's not alone in this, looking for some sense of pushback, and it wasn't there. And as I say, I'm not saying he's a conspiracy theorist at all. He's just making a prediction like we all do. But I do think that the lack of looking at the countervailing forces is an absolute signature of conspiracy theory. That's how you get to the sort of the totalized. The other thing that people do, which is similar between the two, is what you might call stacking your enemies.
Right.
So, you see this in the 70s in the clashes between, the Thatcherites and the trade unions, is you say, so there's the Islamists and the eco-zealots and the left, and then the left become communists, and then they're all kind of working together, and they are infiltrating the schools and they're infiltrating the universities, and all of these things have germs of truth to them. But if you join them all up, as conspiracy theorists do, you end up with this enormous, terrifying monster which we have to jump into action to fight immediately, right? Yeah. Whereas actually, of course, life is never like that. But the irony is that people do it the other side too. So once you have, and this is where it does get a bit dangerous and things need to calm down, is when the left is then saying, well, you've got all these kind of far right parties emerging, and you've got Robert Jenrick, and you've got Nigel Farage, and you've got Tommy Robins, and they sort of bundle them into a monster as well, which again isn't true. There are lots of differences and feuds and ideological splits and barriers in that world too. That's when it takes on the kind of a thinking similar, I think, to conspiracy theory. Yeah,
and let's look at what this unrest, would actually look like. I mean, what would a civil war be in the UK? I suppose people might be talking about a race war, extrapolating from some of the, some would describe ethnic tensions that we've been seeing around the issue of asylum. Yeah. Do you think that's the main sort of potential spark?
I think that's the main vision. I personally do not think it is likely that there is going to be ethnic war in Britain. I will commit to that. And if and when it happens, I will apologise profusely to whoever is demanding that I do so. So as I say, I think that there is a sort of vision that it would be something ethnic. But like I was saying before, what this jumps away from is the economic component to it. I think if there is to be some sort of conflict, it seems logical, given the arguments that these people themselves are making, that it would have that sort of element to it. Now, I really don't see that leading to civil war, but we might start to see more industrial disputes of some kind, or a version of that works in a more sort of broken up economy. Yeah. But again, to go back to the visions that people have of this, I mean, there's a lot of talk about, vulnerable power installations. There's a writer who's just published a book, a left-wing academic who's just published a book about societal collapse as well, about the vulnerability of the systems that we work in, so that a sort of attack on them. There's also talk about urban-rural kind of splits, which is sort of on a basis of sort of, cities are multi-ethnic, the countryside is white, which I'm not sure is entirely true, but you can see the logic. But the thing that I find most sort of puzzling about it, as I say, is how you get from one to the other. I mean, I don't really see the first stages. I think if you start to have full on social breakdown where the police can't cope, the military can't cope, as some people talk about, the economy isn't working, food supplies aren't working. If you start to cut off people's basic supplies, yes, I'm sure people will fight over food in looted supermarkets, that kind of thing. It's how you get across that first sort of jump that I don't quite see in the scenario, is that sort of elided away slightly by saying, well, this is the sort of thing it says in the literature, which I is fair enough, but I don't quite see how the first 2 or 3 stages of this happen.
Yeah, and there was a really interesting report done by More in Common, joint with the UCL Policy Lab and Citizens UK.
This place matters.
Yes, really and it showed, and I'm sure some of our listeners have already seen its results. It showed that actually immigration to an area, they were studying the riot hit areas from last year, wasn't the common factor in what caused places to riot. It wasn't levels of immigration, it was social disconnection. Right. And that could include, not feeling like certain communities had integrated into your neighbourhood, but it could also include, working from home, self-checkouts in supermarkets, just not those opportunities to meet people and have interactions in your neighbourhood like you used to 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Yeah. And part of that is the loss of places to meet, for example. Austerity plays a big role in this, the degradation of the public realm and public services and communal places where you can go for free and there are activities that everyone can participate in. And I think that's something, because it's not very sexy, it's sort of missing from a lot of these kind of conversations. Yeah. But I know that report was read widely in Number 10, and they do actually have quite a solid neighbourhoods policy that they announced in the last fiscal event. So I wonder if, there's some quiet work going on around the country to try and fix those kind of fraying networks.
Yes, I mean, I think that This Place Matters report is brilliant and on point and a useful corrective to some of the more escalatory stuff. I've been doing some work with the Independent Commission on Neighbourhoods on this, and partly looking at sort of historically at how, it's not, I mean, the report is not just the big society, because there has been a tendency with Labour sometimes to think that, you can't do that sort of volunteering stuff, that's just David Cameron and it didn't work. Well, it's also like, a significant strand in the Labour Party's entire history, is, working not just like parachuting into communities, but being of the community, generating the Labour Party from community, the cooperative party as well, the Women's Cooperative Guild, the trade unions. This goes back a long way and is one reason possibly why in the 1920s, not because of some great Englishness, but because society had some social cohesion and fabric to it, that things didn't go into the dark. And I think we do need to get that back. And I think all the factors you mentioned are really important. And as you said, in the spending review, the fact there is some money going into this, is very heartening. And, ICON, who I work with, have played a role in that, I think. Yes. But one of the things that's really important about that, which spools back to, in a way, where we started, is it's also about not just making the facilities better. We often think in a very sort of materialist, measurable sort of way, right? Yeah. But it's also about returning to people, or people recovering for themselves with government's help and facilitation and funding, a sense of agency and control and power over their neighbourhoods. That thing about the hotels being taken is so symbolic, I think, because they feel like that in other contexts too. Now, if you have a sense that if you decide to do something about your local park and clean it up because it's getting too many people taking drugs in it or whatever, and you're going to be empowered to do that. You're not going to be landed with a bunch of rules. You don't have to be a professional. You can actually be trusted to have some agency and make a change, as has happened. You know, I've talked to people who've done this.
Yeah.
You know, that then starts to move you away from, even while we're struggling economically, that starts to move you away from a world where, you know, the only person who's speaking your language is some, you know, chancellor on YouTube.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you only have to look at the results from the big local programme, you know, where $1 million was given to some of these so-called, what we'd call left behind neighbourhoods. And the results have been measurable. You can see, you know, in terms of levels of economic productivity to crime to, you know, just how the high street looks, that it actually does make a difference when you give local people the money to empower them to make their communities better in the way that they can decide, rather than going to Whitehall with a begging bowl.
Yes, exactly.
And I think that's the issue with some of the levelling up policies that seem to have been a bit of a betrayal, actually.
Yes. And also the sense that towns had to kind of, you know, bid.
Yeah.
And also there was the sense that you know, conservative or likely conservative constituencies, frankly, were getting preference, which just repeats the whole disempowerment, politics is a scam, this is unfair, you know, we're being taken for a ride kind of problem, which is another reason why people end up talking in these extreme ways, because the basic problem, right, as you were saying before, is a lack of trust in democratic politics. Now, you don't restore trust in democratic politics by parachuting things in and doing everything through long and complex application processes. You trust people, and sometimes it will go wrong. But I was really struck. I was talking to a guy who I'm working with, the Independent Commission on Neighbourhoods, and he was saying there was a particular earlier project, and this is connected with the local trust. A particular project where a local community group had been given £1 million. Right. And the assumption in Whitehall was that they were going to just chuck it around and waste it and be, you know, incredibly sort of profligate and careless with it. Quite the opposite. You know, the idea of being given £1 million of public money was, you know, the way he was describing the way they talked about it was like this kind of great sort of duty and pressure to spend it. And they were spending it quite slowly because they were so careful with it. So, you know, there's plenty of that waiting. You know, there's plenty of people that are perfectly trustworthy. And if we don't believe that, why do we have a democracy in the first place?